Unplugged in, Hong Kong under siege. Millions take to the streets even after city leaders suspend a controversial bill that would have expanded China's authority to extradite anyone perceived to be a threat to the state. So far, nearly 100 injured in the massive demonstrations that coincided with the 30th anniversary of the bloody protests at Tiananmen Square. Did protesters succeed in tamping down China's extradition bill? Why did Hong Kong officials back down? And what is next for the former British colony? Welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. There's no let-up in Hong Kong, despite an announcement to suspend a controversial proposal to amend the territory's extradition policy, and despite an apology from Hong Kong's chief executive. Protesters were once again out in full force on the streets of Hong Kong. By some estimates, as many as 2 million took to the street demanding an end to the proposed extradition bill. They also called for the immediate resignation of China-backed Hong Kong chief executive Carrie Lam. But as VOA Asia correspondent Bill Gallo reports, despite the government's retreat and chief executive Carrie Lam's apology, there still is no end in sight to the uncertainty that has paralyzed much of Hong Kong.
Hong Kong won't fully become part of China until 2047, almost 3 decades from now. But many in this semi-autonomous city say their way of life is already changing as Beijing expands its influence here. At the heart of the latest protests here was an intensely personal question. Would you trust being sent to stand trial in China's politicized court system? The answer by Hong Kongers was a resounding no. An estimated 2 million people attended the latest protest against the government's extradition proposal. That's over a quarter of Hong Kong's population, a forceful repudiation of China's judicial system. Though the government paused the bill, Hong Kong's future remains uncertain. As Beijing closes in, many feel they have no choice but to consider leaving.
It is happening. It is already happening. People of my age, like in their late 30s, 40s, are already planning, and they are already looking around.
Maybe somewhere Western, more democratic.
Yeah, I will feel ashamed that I will not like to live in here anymore.
We will go to Taiwan or Australia, somewhere that not yet controlled by China.
Hong Kong's reputation as an international financial hub could also be at risk.
One of the reasons why people like using Hong Kong as an Asia base is that on the one hand they can get access to the China market, but on the other hand it's a separate legal system with greater protections of the rule of law and greater protections for private property and the like. If you open any hole to allow the Chinese legal system to creep in, that would obviously have an implication.
Though there's been no rush for the exits, the business community's concern about the extradition law was genuine.
The American Chamber of Commerce, the British Chamber of Commerce, the European Chamber of Commerce, all have expressed considerable concern about this. So from the business community immediately recognized that this was it was completely contrary to one country, two systems principle.
Since Hong Kong lacks fully democratic institutions, one of the only ways people here can push back is through protest. And at this point, the protests only keep getting bigger.
So how long can these protests continue? VOA Northeast Asia correspondent Bill Gallo, who filed that report for us, is right now in Hong Kong's financial district covering the protests. He joins us live on Skype. Nice to see you, Bill. And what provoked this extradition bill to begin with? Why now?
Well, this started whenever a Hong Kong couple went on vacation in Taiwan, and after they came back, it was found out that the man actually murdered the woman. But they could not prosecute the crime unless, because it happened in Taiwan, they could not prosecute the crime without some type of extradition treaty. Well, that led Hong Kong to try to rework its entire extradition laws, including the laws as they relate to mainland China. Now, that's obviously controversial, as China does not have an independent court system. It has something like a 99% conviction rate. If you go to trial in China, you're pretty much going to be guilty. So that was, as I said, a very intense intensely personal debate here. People don't want to be sent to China to stand trial. That's a real concern here.
Bill, the bill has now been suspended. The extradition amendment bill has been suspended, and Carrie Lam has now apologized, but that appears not to be enough for the protesters. Am I right?
No, it really doesn't seem to be enough. Protesters are going to meet tomorrow on Wednesday here to, kind of go over their next steps and see what the strategy is. However, since there are very few democratic options available as far as the institutions that are here, really one of the main options is to protest. So we may see more and more protests. The protests really are getting bigger, and they seem to be working, although not a complete victory. Just even the fact that this bill was paused still shows the power of the Hong Kong people if they actually turn out on the street in those kind of numbers.
Is the extradition bill seen by the protesters as a slippery slope, meaning that if this were to pass and this would enable Beijing to reach into Hong Kong and get people they want to prosecute, do they see that also as a slippery slope, that other rights that they have in Hong Kong will soon evaporate, that Beijing will interfere with them?
Absolutely. I mean, there is a real passion here among protesters, and it's not that they're really into extradition laws or something like that. This is the latest in a long line of debates about rising Chinese influence here. This is a place that has an independent court system, has an independent economic system. There's freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. They do not want to see these things go away. Really, the core of the debate here is how China can convince a people to give up their freedom. And it doesn't seem like it's going to be easy.
Is there a way to quantify the level of passion and determination by these protesters?
There's only 7 million people that live here. If 2 million people really showed up in the protest we saw this week, that's over a quarter of the population. Now, those estimates might be a little bit high, but I can tell you I was in that crowd. It was hard to have perspective when you were in it. However, there are many tall buildings here, including right behind me. If you get up in them and look down on the protest, you could see it was a very, very large amount of people. This also is a very popular movement. This is not driven by something outside. It's not contrived. It's not even really centrally directed. It is very popular right now to come out on the streets and protest.
And at least the reports are the police have not shown a lot of restraint. I mean, there's been tear gas, or maybe they have shown restraint. I guess it depends on your point of view.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think in every crowd there are a few troublemakers. However, the striking thing is the speed at which this got so violent. I mean, in 2014 we had these umbrella protests, and there were months of protests before things really got out of hand. This, almost right away, the stakes seemed to be high on both sides. The police cracked down, and the protesters really looked at this as something they must win, something of an end game for them here.
Thank you. Bill Gallo, VOA Asia correspondent in Hong Kong. Now, despite the indefinite suspension of the extradition bill, the proposal is not expected to disappear anytime soon. Most China watchers believe the proposed law, or some form of it, will be reintroduced again. The bill, initially proposed in February, lays out sweeping changes to Hong Kong's extradition laws, simplifying case-by-case transfers of criminal suspects beyond the 20 countries which already have existing treaties with Hong Kong. The law, if passed, would allow Hong Kong to detain and transfer wanted people to countries with no formal extradition agreements, including Taiwan and mainland China. The bill effectively closes what some Chinese officials describe as a loophole that they claim has made Hong Kong a haven for criminals. But the proposal alarms many in Hong Kong and Taiwan who believe the mainland will use the law to target political dissidents or anyone who disagrees with the government. For a look at how those protests are being viewed in Beijing, we are joined by Bill Ide, VOA's bureau chief in Beijing, on Skype. Bill, I imagine that in Beijing, the Chinese government is looking at these protests much differently than the protesters on the street in Hong Kong. So give me a snapshot of what the Chinese government is saying.
Well, the Chinese government has been supporting the government in Hong Kong, and it's been taking increasing measures over the past week or so to crack down and censor any kind of discussion about the protests online. The censorship this time around, in comparison with the last protests in 2014, is been a lot tighter. They're also trying to shape the narrative and the discussion about the protests, with the foreign ministry citing an online survey that says 800,000 support the extradition law amendments. And they've also then criticized foreign countries who, like Europe or the U.S., who have spoken out and in support of the protesters.
Well, there's one instance in which I read a report that Beijing said that the protesters, they were quite specific, should not become U.S. pawns. Does Beijing believe that U.S. is behind this or is fueling this in any way?
Well, that's been part of the narrative that they've been shaping, and that has come out through state media, that some feel that somehow, even though this was a law that was introduced in Hong Kong by the Hong Kong government, many believe backed by China, but yet somehow the U.S. is behind all this and getting protesters out into the street. So yeah, that's part of the narrative that they're trying to sell to not only to the domestic population, but maybe overseas as well too.
How close is Carrie Lam to the Chinese government? She has apologized, but that's insufficient for the protesters, at least the reports are. But how close? Is she taking any signals from Beijing, or is she independent of them?
Well, that's always been the assumption, that she is basically a puppet, that the critics, of course, of her, that she listens to the Chinese government. Obviously, her actions over the past couple of days, the apology today, seem to show that she has a little bit of flexibility. But the fact that the extradition bill law amendments haven't disappeared and gone away, and there's expectations that they're going to come back again, show that she still is under their control and under their thumb. At least I would think from critics' perspective.
The protesters in Hong Kong, at least many of them, believe this is a slippery slope. It's the extradition bill today, but it's free speech, free assembly. That comes next. Is there any response from Beijing about the allegation that this is just sort of the beginning of an erosion of rights of people in Hong Kong?
Beijing has always denied that was the case. It has kind of forwarded this argument that there are legal loopholes there, that even though aside from the murder case in Taiwan, we really haven't been given a lot of examples. And so they typically will say that no, that's not what is happening here, that the people of Hong Kong are enjoying a high degree of autonomy. But the record, of course, speaks quite differently. Many people in Hong Kong were expecting to have the direct election of their chief executive, and that has not happened. And now we see amendments to extradition law and this legislation that's caused quite a controversy, and many can see that there's perhaps another side to this story.
Thank you. Bill Ide, VOA Beijing Bureau Chief. A U.S. State Department spokeswoman expressed grave concerns over this proposed extradition law and its potential impact on already strained relations between the two economic superpowers. U.S. President Donald Trump, after meeting with Poland's leader who was visiting the White House, also weighed in. President Trump noted the size of the protests, and he expressed hope that both sides would soon reach a compromise.
Well, that was 1 million people. That was as big a demonstration as I've ever seen. So I hope it all works out for China and for Hong Kong.
Are they sending a message to China with these demonstrations?
I don't know what they're sending. I mean, that's a demonstration that they're having. I understand the reason for the demonstration, but I'm sure they'll be able to work it out. I hope they're going to be able to work it out with China.
And we're seeing the people there in Hong Kong, of course, demonstrating for their basic rights, for the rights of freedom of speech, for freedom of assembly, all of these things which are enshrined into basic law. And so, of course, as we observe these, we continue to call on the Hong Kong government to address the concerns of their public, to consult with local and international stakeholders who may be affected by this proposed amendment, even though I know it, of course, has been postponed.
For more on the international repercussions and the potential implications of the Hong Kong protest to U.S. policy, we are joined by VOA's Nike Ching. She covers the State Department and joins us in studio. Nice to see you, Nike.
Good to see you.
Nike, we've seen the reaction from President Trump. Has Secretary of State Pompeo said anything?
Yes, over the weekend, the Secretary of State Pompeo said that when President Trump is expected to meet with the Chinese President Xi Jinping at the G20, he is sure that Hong Kong and other human rights issues will among those being discussed.
Does it appear at the State Department? I realize that we're over at the State Department trying to get as much information out of them at all times. But does it appear that this is of huge concern, the Hong Kong protests? We have other protests going on in the world. We've had situation in Venezuela. But is Hong Kong particularly high on the radar screen for the State Department?
Given the fact that the State Department made a very quick response and making a very clear and tough comment a day after the massive protest on Monday. The protest is on June 9th, Sunday, and then on Monday, the State Department make a quick and clear comment expressing grave concern. It's really high on the radar, and then there are several points that U.S. is expressing concern. Number one, U.S. is concerned of the American citizens living in Hong Kong or visiting Hong Kong may be subject to China's capricious judicial system, and they are fear that if such proposed bill is passed, then it could damage Hong Kong's business environment.
Well, it was interesting to watch Secretary of State Pompeo on a network here in the United States. He was asked about the legislation, and he didn't condemn it. He didn't come out. He sort of danced around, but there was not a condemnation of that extradition bill.
The extradition, they have to be careful because the narrative from the Chinese government is like the U.S. is interfering with the domestic legislation. So the U.S. is saying that the fact that the massive protest that 2 billion people took part on the street are a reflection of people's opposition to the proposed legislature. So the U.S. is sharing concern with those people who fear that if passed, the extradition bill will be lack of procedural protections.
It's very complicated because there's so much going on. For instance, in addition to this in Hong Kong, in the United States, a deep commitment to rights like free speech, free assembly, and the United States' long-time objection to the criminal justice system in China and its human rights record. You've also got the problem there's a trade war going on, and that President Trump is going to meet with President Xi at the G20 at the end of this month in Japan.
Yes, exactly. That's a very interesting, and you nail it. That's the correlation. So also the United States is also expressing concern why the erosion of Hong Kong's, the so-called one country, two systems arrangement that Beijing promised Hong Kong to enjoy a high degree of autonomy, the erosion of that is putting at risk the Hong Kong's long-established special status in the international affairs.
Nike, thank you very much. Our State Department correspondent for Voice of America. Hong Kong, a former British county, has a long and colorful history that dates back to the 18th century. Starting in 1842, when China and Britain signed the Treaty of Nanking, ceding control of Hong Kong Island to the British. In 1898, China leases Hong Kong and 200 other islands to Great Britain for 99 years. But by 1941, with the Second World War underway, Japan takes over Hong Kong, causing a mass exodus to mainland China. Britain regains control after the end of the war. And in 1984, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and China's Premier Jia Ziyang sign a joint declaration laying out the conditions for the return of Hong Kong. Under the agreed-upon one country, two systems agreement, Hong Kong retains its capitalist economic system and its hybrid political system for 50 years starting in 1997. On July 1st, 1997, Hong Kong is officially returned to Chinese control as a special administrative region. Well, there's another date important to Hong Kong citizens, June 4th, 1989. It was 30 years ago this month when Chinese troops and tanks forcefully and violently cleared Beijing's Tiananmen Square of pro-democracy demonstrators. China's proven ability to turn on its own citizens is on the minds of many Hong Kong protesters. VOA's Kevin Enochs reports.
These are some of the images that defined the Tiananmen Square protests. The pro-democracy protests began in April 1989, when nearly 1 million people, primarily university students, gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, demanding a broad series of reforms that included freedom of speech and of the press, as well as more economic accountability. The protests lasted nearly 2 months, until Chinese troops violently ended them nearly 2 months later on June 4th. Peking University student-athlete Fang Zheng was there.
Poisonous gas surrounded us, and one of my classmates fainted. I tried to move her to the side of the road. That's when I saw through the fog that tanks were quickly approaching us. It was too late by the time I noticed. The tank ran over my legs, but I'm one of the lucky ones. A lot of other students were completely squashed under the tanks.
30 years later, hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong citizens are back in the streets. These protests have also been met with force, not tanks, but rubber bullets and tear gas. The protesters are demanding that lawmakers abandon a proposed extradition law brought forward by the city's pro-Beijing chief executive, Carrie Lam.
I will not do anything that is not in the interest of Hong Kong.
The proposed law would make it easier to send Hong Kong residents to Beijing to undergo trial for what they call serious crimes. Some critics worry that under the rule of Chinese President Xi Jinping, criticism of the government will qualify as one of those serious crimes.
And I urge Carrie Lam to withdraw the legislation as soon as possible. And she and the pro-establishment camp should not further betray Hong Kong, betray the rule of law system of Hong Kong.
Tensions between mainland China and Hong Kong have always run high because of perceived attempts by the Beijing government to interfere in Hong Kong's affairs, since it reverted from British to Chinese rule in 1997. Under terms of the handover, Hong Kong is allowed to maintain a separate governing and economic system. Although it is part of China, Hong Kong has a much more democratic and free environment when it comes to civil rights and economics. Hong Kong citizens fear this new proposed law is an effort to bring them fully under Beijing rule. Supporters of the extradition measure admit they underestimated the public reaction and the high level of anxiety about the kind of justice government critics might face in Beijing. Former Hong Kong Governor Chris Patten says those two systems are very different and need to be kept separate.
And once you have this extradition proposal in place, and I hope it'll be dropped even at this late hour. Once that's in place, then you demolish the firewall between Hong Kong's way of life and what's happening in mainland China.
And what's happening in mainland China is that Chinese President Xi Jinping is likely to rule indefinitely after term limits were scrapped in 2018. Authorities have ramped up oppression of minority groups and passed laws that allow for the detention of anyone for up to 6 months without a trial. Public surveillance has increased, as has government control over all sources of information, including the internet, mass media, and even academia. In today's China, the question is not, would a protest like the one that happened in Tiananmen Square 30 years ago be met with violence? The question is, would a protest like the one that happened in Tiananmen in 1989 even be allowed to happen at all in the China of today? Kevin Enochs, VOA News.
So if the Hong Kong protests continue, could we see a repeat of the bloody crackdown the world saw in 1989? VOA Cantonese service correspondent Raymond Yan has been closely following the Hong Kong demonstrations and joins me here in the studio. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Is this profoundly different or similar to Tiananmen Square?
Well, I should say this 30 years ago when the students asking for democracy and asking for anti-corruption. But this time, the student or the young generation in Hong Kong, they simply just ask for maintaining the status quo and also make sure that their civil liberty and freedom can maintain, not because of this extradition law.
Is it a little bit more than that? Because they've gotten what they've asked for. The extradition bill, it's put on hold. It hasn't been abolished, of course. Carrie Lam has apologized. I think she's now apologized twice. But the protesters seem to want more. They want her to go. And there seems to be a fear of a slippery slope that it's extradition today, but it's free speech, free assembly tomorrow. So is there more to this than just the extradition bill at this point?
Because people are worried and they are afraid and they don't trust the government. They're totally lost for the trust between people and the Hong Kong government. And they keep insist that the government should be officially withdraw rather than just pause or maybe not going to bring it for the second reading and electrical. And also people are think that those people who get arrested last Wednesday, they are not a rioter and they are just simply demonstrating and exercise their civil rights, and the riot and the excessive force come from the police, not from the demonstrators. So this is what they demand to cancel all the charges against them, and besides, Carrie Lam should be resigned.
All right, expand this out further. Obviously, the United States has a trade war with China. The people of Hong Kong are worried about the economic implications, so are business leaders. But China has a big economic footprint all over the world, including in Africa. What do these protests mean, big picture, for the world?
Well, this protest, which means that Hong Kong may not be reliable for what the Chinese thought, because the Chinese government would like to treat Hong Kong as a combination of the Silicon Valley and the Wall Street. And so they have their stakeholder that they would like to maintain Hong Kong as calm as possible and nothing happen in order to avoid any economic turmoil or maybe the political turmoil exists. So they do have a huge stake of the situation in Hong Kong and they want to maintain it, but unfortunately I don't see this really happen.
All right, we have 30 seconds left. Obviously Beijing wants to save face, Carrie Lam wants to save face, the protesters are quite determined, and you've got President Trump meeting with President Xi in Beijing at the end of the month. Tell me what's going to happen. Do you have a crystal ball?
That's a very good question. A lot of people don't know will Xi Jinping go to the G20 meeting meet with President Trump. And everybody in Hong Kong, if you ask people in Hong Kong 4 years ago during Umbrella movement, do they want the American will be involved or the international community involved? Lots of people say no. But for past 4 years, people change their mind. And you may see that in the White House, the petition of the online petition, they keep asking the White House or American leadership help to deal with this scenario.
And of course, Beijing wants the United States to stay out of all of its internal problems, even like with the Uyghurs and other instances of humanitarian issues where the United States at least has registered its dissent.
Yeah, and also I would like to point out that 2 weeks ago, the CCC, Congressional Executive Commission on China, headed by Congressman Jim McGovern, co-chaired by Senator Marco Rubio, they are launching the bill called Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. A lot of people, especially the pro-Beijing camp in Hong Kong, they are afraid of this bill because this bill is just sort of like Global Magnitsky Act, which means if someone in Hong Kong ordering do something violent against the demonstrator, they may see the consequences.
Raymond, thank you. Raymond Yam, VOA's Cantonese service. Before we go, some closing thoughts on the latest murder of a journalist in Haiti. Petyan Razpid, nicknamed Duz, was a radio host at Radio Sans Fan in the Haitian capital Port-au-Prince. He was shot and killed June 10th after reporting on anti-corruption protests. Earlier the same day, news vans and cars belonging to news staff, including those from a former VOA Creole affiliate, were targeted and set on fire. Reporters Without Borders tweeted its ongoing concerns about the safety of Haiti's journalists, while hundreds of journalists wearing white demanded justice for their fallen colleague. Ironically, fellow journalists say Razpid was killed after seeking justice for citizens killed during protests for poor people massacred in slums, and for the unsolved disappearance of another reporter 1 year earlier. A friend of Razpid's said he was only doing his job when he was killed, and he urged Haiti's Ministry of Justice to do the same. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America, and you can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta, and do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.
Thank you.